So where does this leave us now, and what's to be done? Well, the world scientists have left us in no doubt that to avoid the worst damage of climate change, we need to cut emissions globally by at least 60% by mid-century, and the Stern report last year put the costs of not acting at up to 20 times greater than the costs of what is required to achieve those deep cuts. But what does that actually mean for Australia? Well, we've been conditioned by the Howard government to believe that deep cuts would devastate Australia's economy. But few people realise what our politicians actually mean when they use terms like hit growth or harm the economy. It doesn't actually mean a smaller economy than what we have today, or lower incomes. So when John Howard says if we cut our emissions in half, it would cut GDP by 10%, 9 out of 10 people, reasonable people in the street, would think that means a smaller economy than today. But what it actually means is that by 2050, our GDP would be 246% greater than it is today in real terms, as opposed to 281% if we kept on the track we're on. As this graph shows, and this will be virtually impossible for people up the back, the Australian economy is still far, far greater by mid-century, even if we halve our emissions. Similarly, when Howard says deep cuts would cut real wages 20%, it doesn't mean we have our pay packets are 20% smaller than they are today. What it means is they'll only be 81% higher in constant dollars. We need to realise that speed is not everything when it comes to the economy. Steering sort of matters as well. Of course, halving emissions means real impact on people and on communities, but change also presents opportunities too. And the longer we leave the transitions deep cuts in our emissions, the further we steer Australia's economy off course in the long run, and the bigger the sacrifices will be for future generations to bring it back. And our alternative, of course, is digging ourselves deeper, and for what? Because we're chasing an apparition after all. Because to come just that little bit richer, we actually have to stay on our current path, 70% higher emissions by mid-century, and no one in their right mind actually believes that's a realistic option. So I don't know about you, but if it's a choice between a car that can go 3.5 times as fast in the right direction, or one that goes slightly faster towards a ditch, I know which one I'd rather be on. So, what has to be done to get us back on track? Well, the first thing is to embrace the idea that Australia has to do with its own emissions what it expects of the rest of the world. And we have to lead by example. So we need to abandon this idea that we can somehow avoid binding emission reduction targets. We need a long-term emission reduction target that is consistent with what's required globally. We need a short to medium-term target or target range, knowing that once we ratify Kyoto, Australia will then negotiate another binding target covering the next commitment period. Then we need to establish an emissions trading scheme that is going to be effective, that has a carbon price sufficient to keep us on track with those medium-term and long-term targets, and doesn't carve out our worst polluting industries. This all needs to be complemented with additional measures for the simple reason that emissions trading is not some fix-all. To ensure that emission cuts are not merely outsourced to other parts of the world, we need a much stronger renewable energy target and much stronger energy efficiency regulation across a range of sectors, especially transport, which emissions trading will hardly affect. Unless we do this, we may find we are merely a donor to the global clean energy transition rather than being part of it. And while we're at it, we need a moratorium on new coal-fired power stations, in my view. And depending on the pace at which carbon capture and storage is actually deployed, we need to rethink our involvement in coal mining. We need to start doing that. Because it's entirely possible that this is an industry that ends up losing the race to become a commercially viable low emissions technology in time. And as a country, we've got to start preparing for that possibility now. And this all needs to be complemented with a serious adaptation policy so that the nation can start really preparing for the inevitable impacts of climate change. And that can only happen with national leadership and coordination.